Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Nat Malkus. I'm an Education Research Fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. I'd like to thank everyone who is joining us here at AEI today, also those who are joining on live stream, and for our friends watching on C-SPAN. Our event today, Charter Schools in the Developing World, with a keynote from Liberian Education Minister George K Werner. We have a simple program. After a few introductory remarks, we're going to have a brief video, a picture's worth 1,000 words, so we're going to give you a couple of minutes of those to root today's conversation about schools in Liberia. Then we'll turn it over to Minister Werner, and he's going to give his keynote address. Following that, we have a fantastic panel today with Seth Andrew from Democracy Builders, Amy Black from Results from Development, and Alejandro Caballero from the International Finance Corporation. I'll introduce them in detail when the panel joins me up here. We'll have about 45 minutes of Q&A time with some opportunity for the audience to join as well. For those following on social media, we have a hashtag for our event. It's hashtag Developing World Charters. You can comment and also send questions, which I will be checking on during the Q&A time. The event, again, is being live streamed, and the full video will be posted online after we conclude today's event. Of course, we're here today to hear from Minister Werner about Liberia's bold approach for school reform. But first, want to give a little bit of context for those who don't already have it. Liberia is a West African nation founded by freed slaves from the United States, primarily in the 1800s. Over the past decades, Liberia has seen some no small tumult. The 1980s saw multiple coups d'etats and sort of a cycle of violence and unrest that culminated in 1989 in the first of two civil wars that lasted for 14 years with hundreds of thousands of casualties and more than 1.3 Liberians displaced. The country stabilized in 2003 to some degree and further in 2006 with the election of President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, a former World Bank economist and eventual Nobel Peace Prize recipient. Under President Sirleaf, Liberia continued to stabilize, to build democratic institutions, difficult work after years of war and political instability. And in 2014, the Ebola outbreak hit, killing thousands of Liberians, and of course a difficult emergency and destabilizing event for the country, which has come out trying to build economic growth and democratic institutions since then, combating poverty and strengthening an education system that was shuttered for the better part of a year. On many educational measures, Liberia lags behind its other African peer countries with low levels of primary school attendance and completion, low literacy. An illustrative statistic, in 2013, nearly 25,000 students took the University of Liberia entrance exam and no one passed. This led President Sirleaf to call the education system a mess generally, and she charged Education Minister George Werner, who's here today with us, to chart a new course for Liberian education. Mr. Werner has taken up the challenge, and in 2016, he announced a bold plan, the Partnership Schools for Liberia program, in which independent school operators would run 93 primary schools that were partially funded by the government. The program, as most ambitious reforms do, has drawn criticism and praise alike. Detractors fear the consequences of public school privatization, and supporters cite the need for innovative change in a failing school system. In 2016-17 school year, 28,000 Liberian school children attended 93 PSL schools. Those are Partnership Schools for Liberia schools, run by 8 Liberian and international providers. These educational reforms come at a time of major political change. In October, Liberia will elect a new legislature and president in the first democratic transfer of power since 1944. This will be a test of Liberia's young democratic institutions, and with a new administration on the horizon and bold reforms underway, Liberia and its school reforms face both great change and great opportunity. Now, a picture is as good as 1,000 words, and so before we bring up Minister Werner to the podium, we have a brief video to give you a sense of the schools in Liberia and the context for the PSL reforms. Short video gives you some view on Liberian schools, and today, now I'd like to invite Education Minister George Werner to come up and give his keynote. He has previously taught at the high school and college levels. He was the Director General and Head of Liberian Civil Service from 2013 to 2015. He currently co-chairs Liberia's Health Workforce Development Task Force, and of course, is the Minister of Education. Join me in welcoming Minister Werner.
Thank you, Nat, for the kind introduction, and thank you to AEI for welcoming us here. I'm here today to discuss Liberia's experience with public-private partnerships in education. First, let me say that I'm honored to be here on behalf of the Liberian government and our president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. As most of you know, President Sirleaf became the first democratically elected female president in Africa in 2005. That election was also another first for Liberia. It was the first presidential election since the brutal rule of Charles Taylor and the devastating conflict that crippled our country and took more than 200,000 lives. President Sirleaf will be leaving office in January of next year, having served 2 terms. Her departure from office, respecting constitutional term limits, marks another important milestone that should not be overlooked. It will be the first peaceful transfer of power in my country since 1944 and will consolidate our post-war democracy. As the presidential campaigns gather pace in advance of the elections in just a few months' time, I am struck by just how far we have come. When you pick up a newspaper or turn on the radio in Liberia, you will see and hear evidence of spirited political debate, a vibrant press, and an engaged civil society. This is an achievement we should not take for granted. Though I must say, occasionally, I remind myself that when I am one in the line of fire of criticism. Beyond our democratic achievements over the past decade, Liberia has emerged as a post-conflict success story. Innovations in public-private partnerships have been introduced, scaled, and are creating new platforms for collaboration in healthcare, human and institutional capacity building, philanthropy, infrastructure, and education. We owe a debt of gratitude to the United States for serving as a partner along the journey. Through both Democratic and Republican administrations, through war and the return of peace, and most recently through the fight against Ebola, the United States has been an essential partner. I want to thank the American people for your steadfast support. I want to thank all who contributed to ending Ebola in my country. And I know I speak on behalf of not only the Liberian government, but also the Liberian people when I say that we look forward to continuing our partnership long into the future. When you look at the demographic trends, not just in Liberia, but across the continent of Africa, it becomes clear why international partnership and collaboration are more important than ever before. Today, there are 420 million Africans between the ages of 15 and 35. That number is expected to nearly double to over 830 million by 2050. This youth bulge can either be a demographic dividend with the potential to transform our economies, or it can be a ticking time bomb, which depends on one thing: education. 10 to 12 million African youth currently enter the workforce every year, many without the literacy or numeracy skills they need to succeed in finding meaningful employment. Our education systems are failing to prepare our children for the jobs of yesterday, let alone the jobs of tomorrow. Too many of our young people faced with a hopeless future at home are fleeing the continent and are risking their lives to find opportunities abroad. At the same time, countries across the continent are facing increased demands and pressures not only on our education systems, but also healthcare and social services. Budgets are stretched to the breaking point. In this context, African leaders need to think outside the box and find innovative solutions. In Liberia, this is exactly what we have done. We are educating the first generation of Liberian children who have not known war or conflict. They are too young to have experienced the days when children, rather than going to school, were recruited as soldiers in the bloody conflict that tore our country apart. We hold the dreams and aspirations of this new generation in our hands. It is our responsibility to ensure that they have opportunity to succeed. That responsibility was front and center in my mind when I was appointed Education Minister by President Sirleaf in June of 2015, and is still what drives me every day. When I took the helm at the Ministry of Education, I already understood some of the challenges that I would face. I knew that our education system was failing to educate, that 35% of our young women and 21% of our young men could not read a single sentence. I knew about the gender gap and that only 39% of women across Liberia completed primary school. And I knew about the inequality in education access in our rural areas, where only 26% of women and 58% of men were illiterate. I had read all the studies and knew all the stats. And as a former teacher myself, I had seen it firsthand. But when I began traveling across the country, visiting schools, speaking to teachers, parents, and children, it became clearer that bold reform was urgently needed. Maintaining the status quo was not simply an option. We absolutely could not risk failing this or any future generation of Liberian children. So we embraced the opportunity to implement bold reforms and truly transform our education system. We launched a 3-year plan that includes increasing professionalization of teachers and principals across the country and conducting rigorous monitoring and evaluation to ensure we stay on track to reach our goals. We have undertaken an aggressive project to identify and remove ghost workers from the teacher payroll. To date, we have removed nearly 2,000 ghost workers, which have led to $2.5 million in annual savings that can be reinvested in education. We also launched an innovative public-private partnership that is testing new models for improving Liberia's public schools. That program, Partnership Schools for Liberia, or PSL for short, is what I'm here to discuss today. As I mentioned earlier, PSL has an important distinction from the charter school model that you have here in the United States. All the schools in the program remain within the public school system and employ teachers on the government payroll. They also do not admit students selectively, not based on socioeconomic status or on academic performance. Through the PSL program, we've partnered with 8 education providers, some local, some international, some not-profit, some for-profit, each with a different model, but all with proven experience in delivering quality education and improving literacy and numeracy outcomes. Those 8 providers within the program are Bridge International Academies, which I'm sure we will speak more of during the discussions. I had seen their operations in Kenya firsthand and in Uganda, and was impressed by the learning outcomes they were able to achieve, and I invited them to Liberia to partner with the government of Liberia to do same. More Than Me, a non-profit which was already running an academy in Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, providing both education and services like healthcare, psychosocial support, and a feeding program for vulnerable girls. Street Child, another non-profit provider, which also operates in Sierra Leone and Nigeria, and has a focus not only on providing education, but also training and supporting communities to manage and hold their schools to account. Rising Academies, which also operates a network of schools in Sierra Leone and has a whole child approach to education. BRAC, an NGO founded in Bangladesh that has experience working across Africa. Omenga, which runs a network of schools in nearby Ghana. And last but not least, the Liberian Youth Network, or for short, Leonet, and Stella Marie's, both local and Liberian providers. In the first year of PSL, which just concluded, these 8 providers operated, as you heard earlier, 93 schools in 13 counties across Liberia, providing free quality education to around 27,000 children. Following the first year, we are seeing some encouraging initial results. According to the baseline data, we've seen both increased enrollment and beneficial impacts on teacher behavior, including reduced absenteeism and greater time teaching. Teacher attendance rates are above 90% on average across all PSL schools and are as high as 98% in the case of one provider. Teachers are also 9% less likely to be off task or outside the classroom at PSL schools. These may seem like small things that should be taken for granted, but they are no minor achievements in the context such as Liberia. To date, the program has also delivered much needed resources, including desks, chairs, infrastructure, learning materials, a teacher for every classroom, and expanded teacher training opportunities. It has also generated a new appreciation for a longer school day, all without charging any fees. Just this week, 4 of the 8 providers in our PSL program released their own midline reports, assessing their efforts during the first year of the program and highlighting key successes in improving learning outcomes. It is deeply encouraging to see not only their commitment to measurement and evaluation, but also their positive impact on crucial areas including literacy and numeracy. Teacher training and engagement of parents, communities in teachers' learning. Rigorous, independent measurement and evaluation has been built into the program from an early stage. We are currently awaiting results of an independent assessment being carried out by the Center for Global Development in partnership with Innovations for Poverty Action. While we await those results, we will move into year 2 with the modest increase in the number of PSL schools from 93 to 200, about 7% of Liberia's public schools. In the coming year, we will prioritize reaching remote regions such as the southeast of Liberia, which has socioeconomic conditions that make its needs particularly acute. PSL is an innovation that has the potential to accelerate the provision of quality education and ultimately make it accessible to all Liberian students in a way it has never been before. But this program is strictly evidence-based, so we will not move forward with any large-scale expansion until we have received the completed independent assessment and can judge the impact of PSL on the students and the school system. As we assess what the future of PSL will look like, what remains clear is that bold action is needed if we are going to properly educate and prepare our children for the future. A study conducted by the Brookings Institution, where I was before I came here, estimates that there is a 100-year gap between the developing world and the developed world when it comes to academic achievement. 100 years. If we're going to leapfrog that divide, innovation isn't an option, it's a necessity. If the results are as compelling as we think they will be, PSL could serve as a model for high quality, low cost education that can be scaled not only in Liberia or even in Africa, but in other countries around the world that are recovering from conflict and crisis. We look forward to harnessing opportunities like today to share our story with colleagues and partners across the globe. I look forward to hearing your questions about our experience and to a lively and productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Werner. And let me also thank the panel that you see before you who have made time to join us today for this conversation. Next to Minister Werner is Alejandro Caballero. He's a senior education specialist on the health and education team at the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. There he evaluates investments in private education companies. Before joining IFC, Alejandro was a senior education specialist at the World Bank, working with governments in higher education, science, technology, and innovation in the Latin American and Caribbean region. Before joining the World Bank in 2006, Mr. Caballero was vice president with Deutsche Bank, working in East Asia. Thanks for coming, Alejandro.
Thank you.
Amy Black, we're lucky to have her. She's the executive vice president of global education at Results for Development. Previously, Ms. Black served as the vice president of growth strategy and development for Teach for All, which is a global network of more than 40 national partner organizations that work to improve educational opportunities for marginalized youth. Before helping establish Teach for All, Amy was the executive director of the Washington, D.C. region for Teach for America. And before that, she oversaw international communications for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief and spent 2 years as a presidential management fellow, rotating through the State Department offices, including a 6-month stint in South Africa. Thank you, Amy, for joining us. And last but not least, Seth Andrew. If you know Seth, that is Seth in a blue hat down there at the end. If you don't know him, Seth is the founder of Democracy Builders and usually wears a yellow hat. So he's currently working with Bridge International Academies to help governments launch more than 300 charter-like schools in Liberia, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and India. Mr. Andrews served as the senior advisor in the executive office of the president and led the education and civic technology portfolios. And he also served as a senior advisor to former U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan. He founded and served as a teacher, principal, and superintendent of Democracy Prep, a network of more than 20 public charter schools from Harlem to here in Washington, D.C. Thank you, panel, for joining us. I'm going to give each of you just a few minutes to sort of give a reaction to Minister Werner's keynote and your thoughts on the PLS program. Seth, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. This is something that I have been so passionate about for the past 4 months. And I didn't know how passionate I could be about something for 4 months until I met Minister Werner. We met in the end of January, early February, and he had this conversation with me where he was asking questions about the U.S. charter sector like, well, there's the D.C. model with 50% saturation and the New Orleans model with 100% saturation, or there's Denver with only, and I sort of said, wait, you're the Minister of Education of Liberia? and you understand the charter sector in this way that is compelling and interested and deeply researched. And so he inspired me sincerely, and so I just want to thank you publicly, Minister Werner, for the opportunity to be in this space, to think about different ways to govern public schools. Because in the US, we've been thinking this through for about 20 years in a relatively slow and steady curve. In the US, about 3 million American students attend public charter schools. These are public schools funded by the public but attended open enrollment by any student in a geographic catchment area, but managed independently, managed by organizations that are not necessarily the government itself. And so when Minister Werner was telling me about his vision for PSL and what they'd already started to build, I really bought in immediately because I saw the potential for leveraging some of the best practices of what we've learned in the US and some of the Liberian-specific context elements that Minister Werner knew all about and I knew nothing about. So having those two elements has really been something that has inspired me to dig into this work and realize that we can rethink what public education is. And so for me, it was the urgency of the Liberian case, but really thinking about Africa as a whole that inspired me to dig in because, as Minister Werner said, we have 800 million kids on this continent waiting to be educated, with right now 263 million kids around the world who are not in school at all, another 330 million kids who are in school but learning nothing, including many in Liberia, having no outcomes whatsoever. And so if we keep doing the same thing and expecting different results, that's our definition of insanity. But in the case of Liberia, where they're 100 years behind, we can't just keep doing that. And so I think the key word for me that I want to come back to as we go a little bit deeper in is leapfrogging. If Liberia just takes an incremental approach and increases their budget by 5%, or trains their teachers a little bit better, or changes the second grade curriculum a little bit, they're not going to catch up, they're not going to leapfrog, they're not going to change what is possible for Liberian kids, more than 1 million children. And so for me, the exciting part is seeing what is not just incremental, but actually really bold and big and visionary. And that's why I'm excited for PSL. And we can quibble over whether it's a partnership school or a charter school or the definition. But the big idea here is rethinking what the definition of public schools is and who manages the public schools. Is it the government or is it a partner organization that might have different expertise giving students and families a choice in where they attend and the kinds of education they're receiving? And for me, that's what's really exciting about this work, and I'm looking forward to digging in more.
Amy.
I'm also very excited to be here. I'm the relatively new leader of the education team at Results for Development. And at Results for Development, we focus on healthy and educated people and really try to do that in the most systemic way possible through the partnerships that we pursue. And we operate in the intersection between research, the global research that's available, and trying to get that into the hands of people on the ground so that they can use it. And we really position ourselves behind and beside local stakeholders to make sure that they're as effective as they can possibly be with as little effort on their part to get that global information as possible. And in that role, we work very hard with leaders across all parts of a society, so particularly public sector leaders, which, as we know, are responsible for the vast majority of marginalized people in the world, and so really value our relationships with our public sector partners. We also steward a 750 organization network in the civil society, so innovative organizations across the world in ed tech and girls' education and early childhood that we were working with to help them answer research questions, get what they're teaching us back out to the broader landscape. And what I'm really excited about as it pertains to this conversation is our work in the last 2 or 3 years in the low-fee private school space, and where we are working with private sector operators, and particularly our work that we call adaptive learning. And so in Ghana and Sierra Leone and Liberia, we have spent a lot of time with a team that does research, uses traditional research methods, but close to the ground, grassroots operators, really gets at the level of a school or a group of schools and says, what are your biggest challenges that you're facing in the next month or the next year? And what are your theories about what it's going to take to overcome those? And let's test and fail fast and win fast and try a few things out and be much more successful by this time next year. And we think that that kind of research combined with, of course, the more rigorous, longer term and more costly research that is absolutely needed is also a key part of seeing efforts like this be more and more successful. So we're excited to have done that in partnership with the IDP Foundation in Ghana, where we really looked at what are the barriers to financing for operators like this. In Sierra Leone and Liberia, we're actually looking at academic outcomes and how are we helping local stakeholders answer their specific questions like, what is it going to take to get our secondary school kids more literate in the next 6 months? So that's the work we've been doing. We're excited to engage. I think there are a few things that we come to this work, a few principles that we believe at R4D are important. We think it's important to have a shared set of goals across sectors, that if everybody's oriented toward outcomes for kids, it becomes less about who's doing what and more about are we getting there together. We think public with private rather than public versus private is a good way of framing things. Private operators are in vast abundance across the world, and a lot of the questions we support our public sector partners to think about is how do we leverage that in the most productive way. We do believe that government is in a stewardship role, that at the end of the day, the government is responsible for outcomes, especially for low-income kids, and so that has to be taken into account when we consider the dynamics that are at play. We absolutely believe there's a need for data at all levels of the system, and you've heard the minister talk about how important that is here, and we're, as I said, striving to be a participant in getting the data at the grassroots level. And of course, which you heard the minister talk about, context matters so much. There's a unique history here, there's a unique history in every country. History matters, and I think time matters. I think a lot of times conversations only assume a year or 2 year horizon when we know that these challenges need to take that horizon into account, but also 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And how do different players behave and respond when the context shifts as well? So these are things we're excited to be thinking with a multitude of actors and players about it, Results for Development, and I'm very excited to be part of the conversation.
Alejandro.
Thank you. And I represent IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, and we're very excited to be here, and thanks Minister Werner for this very interesting presentation. We try to look for models at IFC that can be scalable and that can be replicated in multiple countries around the world, and we try to learn from experiences and from what has worked in one part of the world and take it to another part of the world with a main focus on developing countries. And obviously, this is mainly in the context of the learning crisis that we are seeing, in particular in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. No? I mean, there's been significant progress achieved over the past decade or so in ensuring that children are actually in school and that there's close to universal enrollment, at least at entry, because as we saw in the statistics for Liberia, I mean, transition to secondary education remains a big issue for many sub-Saharan African countries. But in that context of the learning crisis, it's really about student outcomes, and it's really about what children learn. And I think Minister Werner talked about something which is very, very important. No, I mean, starting with the basics in some of these contexts. No, are the teachers actually in school? Are teachers actually delivering the lessons that the children need? I mean, there's some studies by the World Bank where we highlight that there's significant time that is non-instructional time in many countries in the region, and that's definitely a big issue. And we'll see that some of the models that we'll talk about, like Bridge International Academies, have tried to address that issue of teacher accountability and making sure that at least, I mean, a teacher is sitting in front of the students and delivering a lesson, I mean, for 50, 55 minutes if we're talking about an hour lesson. Obviously, in the context of this learning crisis, it is very important to have innovative solutions and to really, I mean, do what Minister Werner talked, like bold reforms. I mean, aiming to do things that maybe challenge a little bit the status quo. And obviously, I mean, we cannot but agree with the evidence-based approach that was mentioned, and that's another very important point I think that was raised. I mean, in order for these experiences to be replicable and for other governments to be able to work along these lines, we really need to create the evidence. And I'm sure we'll come back to this in the conversation, but really, the evidence about what works in PPPs in education and I mean, is still nascent, and we're delivering it and we're building it. And I think the more we can go in this direction with, impact studies that will really look into what works and what really brings student outcomes and learning outcomes to to the table, I think that the better we will be, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. So everything, I mean, that was presented is exciting. I'm happy to go deeper into some of these issues. For us at IFC, promoting private sector in education is very important. That's one of the reasons why we supported Bridge International Academies. I mean, because we saw potential for innovation and for doing things differently in the education space. And obviously in that context, we're also happy to see that the bridge model can be applied in a public education context, and that's also part of our interest in this dialogue.
Well, thanks everyone. I want to start off with the charter schools conversation, in large part because it's in the title of our event here today. It's also part of our hashtag, which is hashtag Developing World Charters. It's a little problematic. The word charters is accessible to an American audience. It helps an American audience understand what we're talking about, but we're not really talking about charters. We're talking about partnership schools. So my question is, just to get this sort of fleshed out at the start, what are some of the key and fundamental differences for an American audience to understand between the partnership schools and American charter schools, and what might be the best language to talk about these partnership schools? And anyone can just jump on in and give their take.
I know the minister has strong feelings about this. So I come from the American charter school sector. So I'll just give you a couple of the things. The reason that I think this is what is happening in PSL really are charter schools by our definition. They're public buildings. They're publicly funded. They're open access and enrollment. There are no fees for students whatsoever. The state standards are what have to be met. They're accountable for results to their authorizer, in this case, the state of Minister Werner. And that, to me, defines a public charter school. That is what we do here in the US. Now, the differences, and they are very important, are, I think, a subclass of charter schools. One is that in Liberia, partnership schools are actually public workers. They are on the public payroll, not the non-governmental organizations' payroll. They're union members sort of by default, and that payroll and that public worker status changes the dynamic. But there are places in the United States where charter school teachers are members of the union as well. There are places where the districts are the authorizer, where the actual district itself is the authorizer. So I think charter is the apt term for this. I understand the value of partnership, and I think Amy's point that this is sort of public with not private, not public versus private is a really important one, because this really is a partnership. I mean, what the operators, the 8 operators that are operating in Liberia are doing is partnering with the government to deliver better results. And that really is the definition of a charter. In the case of Liberia, there's an MOU between the operator and the government. And that is, in function, the charter, the authorizing document that stipulates what the operators will provide, how they will provide it, what they're expected to deliver. So I think at the end of the day, they are charters. Now, there's some great research that some folks have been doing lately about this spectrum of charters between those in the Liberia context where they're public employees to those that are much further in the other spectrum where they are the equivalent of closer to vouchers, where the government is basically just doing a transfer of funds to attend a low-P public school, a low-P private school, or another type of school. And so there's a whole spectrum that are met here. And to me, the definition of charter are these open schools, publicly funded and publicly accountable. And to me, this program definitely meets that, which is part of why it's so exciting. I will say quickly about Bridge, the bulk of their schools, nearly 500 across the world, are these low-fee private schools for about $7 a month. Students are getting a world-class education. But that still means it's $7 a month. And what's so profound about Minister Werner's work is that these are zero-fee schools. There's no textbook fees, there's no uniform fees, there's no PTA fees, there's none of these fees that in the developing world, and if you're new to this space, you have to understand, traditional public schools charge these fees. So traditional public schools are not free in much of the developing world, and yet Minister Werner has made a system of schools that are run by private or non-governmental organizations that actually are free. So our notion that somehow free equals public is not the right notion for Africa, where that's not actually generally true. But in fact, in the PSL program, partnership schools are in fact free for students or for families. So the paradigm shifts a little bit, but I think charter is still the right term.
So, thank you, Seth. Let me just say something just to add to what Seth just said. With the exception maybe of Singapore and Vietnam, I don't know any country that educates poor children with perfection. Not the United States, not the UK. If the US government could deliver perfect public schools, you will have no need for charter schools. If the UK government could do similarly, there would be no need for the academies in the UK. What that tells me is that governments are failing to educate poor children. And there is a need for partnership with the private sector. First reason, we are not educating our children just for the public sector jobs only. Few of them get into the public sector, and depending which president is in power, you can have that workforce reduced. So we are educating majority of our kids for the private sector, for the jobs of today and the jobs of tomorrow. All the more reason why the private sector needs to be called to get involved in how we educate our children. So this is why in Liberia we chose the word partnership. There are things government does very well. Policy platform, regulation, education as a public good. Those things government can do well. But day-to-day management, assessments of learning outcomes, systems of accountability, government doesn't do as well as the private sector does. So we partner with private providers to strengthen government where it is weakest, if you like. That's the essence of the partnership with us.
I'm interested that I want to just follow up on that, and anyone can answer, and Seth, we can hear briefly about Bridge, but across the PSL participants, we have eight different providers, and so I'm wondering what are some specific things, some specific aspects of the models that they bring that the public schools would not be able to develop on their own? Where is the secret sauce or the promise that they bring that can be achieved through the PSL program? Seth, you want to describe Bridge?
Well, so
briefly?
I think less about Bridge and more about the PSL program. One of them is curriculum. This seems like a relatively small thing, and that sort of should be a fundamental of school is, curriculum, what we teach. But when you walk into a government school in Liberia, you don't find curriculum. In fact, you walk in and you see on the chalkboard, it says 2015 on the top, because they haven't had chalk or anybody write on the chalkboard since 2015. And so you have these moments, these stark realizations that learning just isn't happening in a lot of these places. So the operators, the 8 operators that Mr. Werner brought in are bringing with them curriculum. And so More Than Me, which has been operating in Liberia for a long time, has a specific curriculum. And Bridge has a specific curriculum. And Rising has a specific curriculum. And each one of these operators brings their curriculum that has very concrete goals and then is aligned to the Liberian national standards. So in the case of Bridge, where most of our schools in Kenya, we had a curriculum team working in Liberia to align the curriculum we designed for other parts of Africa specifically to Liberian curriculum. And so you have to make sure that it is local context. But curriculum is one of the biggest elements. And then the second, and George alludes to this, but I think it's really important to think about, is the government is not usually thought of as the leader in technology. So I just left the Obama administration where we really spent a lot of time, the chief technology officer and others, thinking about technology in government. And I can still tell you we were way behind where the private sector was in thinking about technology. Most of us don't use government tech in our daily lives. We use private sector tech in our daily lives. And so what Bridge has done is taken that curriculum from the best practices in the developed world in American charter schools and delivered it through a very low-tech solution, a really cheap e-reader, a sort of black and white tablet that costs about $50 to manufacture in China. You get a content that is the same content as kids might be getting in Washington, D.C. or Boston or Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they're getting it on a 2G signal in black and white in a rural Liberian classroom. And that is a thing that the government of Liberia hadn't figured out how to do yet, and the private sector has figured out how to do. The NGOs have been more aggressive in adopting curriculum and technology into their curriculum, into their practice, which I think is one of the reasons that this has potential not just to be an incremental change, but really a leapfrogging change.
Yeah, I think another important element, I mean, there's an incentive to measure. Once you bring the private sector in, I mean, very quickly there will be questions. I mean, is this better than what we had before? No, and that brings a very clear incentive to start measuring things, to developing either a pilot like the one that's currently underway, or eventually even proper full-fledged impact evaluations. No, and it might seem very obvious, but it does bring very quickly the measurement part of it, and something that really helps bring the discussion to a new level, because there's evidence that's being created, and that's really what's happening or starting to happen in the Liberian case. No?
You bring up evidence, and so I have sort of two questions. Bite at the first one that you're interested in taking. The first is just across the developing world, what evidence have we seen for these public-private partnerships, particularly in education for low-income students? And also in terms of the PSL, what specifically has Minister Werner, have you done to bake into the program a way to measure its outcomes that's rigorous and that can provide evidence to other countries and to the citizens of Liberia?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about about some of the studies that have taken place. First of all, there's different types of PPPs. No, I mean, and obviously, typically, I mean, there's these two axes: who operates and who finances, be it public or private. And depending on this, obviously, there's different combinations that can take place. I mean, in most cases, I mean, one of the, of the PPPs that people talk about is vouchers, no? And vouchers have been tested in different contexts. We're quite familiar at the World Bank with the experience in Chile, for instance, no? Where there was, a voucher program that was implemented, and obviously a multiple efforts to assess the efficacy of that voucher program. And what happened, I mean, in most of the measurements is that, I mean, the evidence was not conclusive, to be really clear. I mean, the different studies were suggesting different things, and typically it comes down to the question. I mean, if are we measuring things all else equal? Basically, are we really taking into account all the unobservable variables that can affect student learning outcomes? And that was obviously, part of the discussion that we had in Chile. I think in the case of charter school, I'm sure Seth and Amy would have specific evidence about the US. I think there's more robust studies and maybe more conclusive. At least in some of the cases, there's very clear evidence that this has worked. In the context of developing countries, we have examples like Colombia with the concession schools, which are quite relevant and with interesting findings, in support of potential, good performance by private schools. But the question is, I mean, it's really the fact that private schools are performing well compared to other public schools sufficient evidence that PPPs will work? I mean, I think there's other elements in the discussion as well. I mean, one of them has to do with, I mean, are we talking about the same things? No, and in particular in the sub-Saharan African context, I've had conversations with a number of ministers of education, and the question is, I mean, are we really talking about public finance kicking into the PPP model? In some cases we are, and in some cases we might not be looking at the same type of model. So really setting up the definition of what we're talking about is quite important. And then there's the second element of whether, I mean, the moment you have public finance kicking in and working together with the private sector, whether you're really able to build that system that will work from, a governance, monitoring and evaluation perspective, operational perspective, and so on and so forth, which is what Minister Werner is currently dealing with. No, so obviously in the context of developing countries, to be frank, I mean, we need to create this evidence. We don't have that many experiences. The ones that we have, like in the case of vouchers, sometimes bring inconclusive answers, but there's eagerness and willingness to go down that route by many governments in developing countries, and creating that evidence with specific examples, pilots, and measuring those pilots is really what I think will help build a little bit the knowledge about this space. No?
So what in Liberia we immediately thought of and did with the support of the international community was, and now led by the Center for Global Development and Innovations for Poverty Action, IPA, is that we needed a rigorous evaluation of the program to generate the evidence to inform policy in terms of whether or not we should stop or continue, and at what scale, and what the gaps would be in terms of what we're looking at. So we commissioned a randomized control trial, and the baseline is completed. By August, we should have the midline, I think somewhere towards the end of August, the midline report should be made available to inform the world about many of the things that we are looking for in terms of evidence. I must admit that the RCT was commissioned for 3 years. And so we still have some way to go yet to know whether or not this program is giving us what we want to do. Let me remind you that it's only in the second year that we are trying to reach the remotest part of Liberia. We also have to examine whether or not PSL works in those contexts where you have too many rivers that children have to canoe up a river, or as you saw in the short video clip, walk across sticks to get to schools, and what the implications are for a country with 7 months of heavy rainfall, during which time children don't have access at all to some of the school infrastructure.
I don't have much to add except to say it is true. We just need more evidence. We need more time, and we need resources to go into evaluation. And there is a lot of discussion in the global community about that. And so I do think that that is on its way. I'll reiterate that I think we are excited, and Results for Development is not by no means the only organization doing this type of work, but in the meantime, there are kids that are in school every day, and those practitioners need to know roughly where they are. So we're excited about the less rigorous but more immediate research that can be done to create trajectories where operators actually know that they're on the right path. And there's, a bottoms-up and a top-down approach to this, and I think it'll be very important to see in the coming years, months and years, if these sorts of engagements are getting the results. But there's an opportunity to do both, to do the summative assessments, to look back and see what we think has happened, but to simultaneously be preparing operators for hopefully a positive outcome by making sure that they have the tools and resources in-house, like at the level of a school, to be thinking the way that researchers think and to be answering their own questions. And so there's a growing need for that as well. And I think both of these pieces can come together to hopefully get results, and not just in private settings, but also in public settings. This is the kind of work that we as educators need to be doing everywhere here in the US and in Liberia and everywhere else. So I think there's another body of work that is also burgeoning that can complement these larger studies as well.
So I have two somewhat contradictory thoughts that I admit are contradictory, but I think are both important in this context. The first is that we have started already to see results. And so I think your point, and the difference really is between formative and summative, right? So some of this research needs to be formative. We need to be making decisions tomorrow about the lesson that we tried yesterday that didn't work and fix it tomorrow. That's research. That's not a full RCT, but it's good research that we need to identify how to get a teacher to have better practice tomorrow, and that's important. Minister Werner mentioned that 4 of the providers have already released their midline results. Bridge, for example, had 4 times as many students in the control in the treatment schools and in the control groups meet the reading benchmarks. And that was just after 4 months of instruction. So you're starting to see outcomes that are already there on the short term. For Bridge in Kenya, where you've got a much bigger data set and 10 years of data, you're seeing in 83% of the counties in which we operate across the whole country, the outcomes on the end of school exam, the 8th grade exam for elementary school, the students at Bridge are outperforming the counties, even though Bridge students are dramatically poorer than the counties as a whole. So you're starting to see great results, and I think the results are there and important. But the contradictory part I want to say to myself is that at some stage, we have to actually say to ourselves that we cannot wait for evidence to make change. We cannot stop in a place like Liberia, where we have 1 million kids, hundreds of thousands who are getting zero education every day, and say, let's wait for the results for a couple of years, and maybe then we'll figure it out. I mean, we are talking about kids who are learning nothing every single day, kids who are opting out of school in many cases completely, and then to say we're going to wait for a 5-year RCT until we scale up is a mistake. Now, I'm thrilled that we have the RCT, so I think Minister Werner's instinct to say we need good, rigorous evidence is right, but that doesn't mean that we should stop moving. My boss at the Department of Education used to say that one of the funny things of the US Department of Education is our highest standard for evidence was the Investing in Innovation Fund. But we gave away billions of dollars for the funds that were not about innovation. But in innovation, it's the one thing we should expect no evidence, because it should be innovative. It should be the thing that we haven't tried before. It should be the thing that is bold and new and different. And so although we should be informed by evidence and best practices in other countries and different contexts, it doesn't mean that we should be paralyzed by waiting for the results of long-term of studies before we say these kids need to have a great kindergarten next year or tomorrow.
So schooling certainly can benefit from some innovation. It also benefits from funding. And for a Western audience, I just want to try and talk for a moment about the cost differential. Okay, so in American public schools, we spend about 12 grand a year per kid. And in Liberian public schools, they spend $50 per pupil per year, which is a 240 multiple, right? 240 times less. So first of all, how do you do that? I just can't even get my head around it. And I have a couple other questions that maybe we can follow up on that about how can Western companies, certainly for-profit or not-for-profit, just survive in such a low-cost environment?
So let me start so that others will follow, maybe. Since it's, let me give you the context for Liberia. Last year, our education budget was around $41 million US dollars. Of that 41 million, 35 million for payroll. So you see where I'm going with that, right? So much of the $50 that Nat spoke about is dedicated to payroll. You actually have nothing for what, in essence, contributes to quality. Teacher training, textbooks, and all of these things. So that is the backdrop to the $50. So when we initiated PSL, we sought blended funding. We went to private philanthropy foundations, and then we said, look, what if you were to give an extra $50 to these operators, making it $100, right? But the $50 you give them will be for innovations to meet what we set out together that we wanted to achieve. In year 2, because we are consolidating to areas that are more difficult than year 1, we're saying $60. But you still see that that is not expansive enough to cover the cost. What this tells me is all the noise about for-profit, I don't know who is making profit in this environment. So I just wanted to lay that context for you to get a sense of the struggle we are in with the operators to make sure that children have access to equal quality education.
So I can say for Bridge that they're not making a profit in Liberia, which is the reality of working in this context, but partially because the scale's not big enough. So right now, Bridge is educating about 9,000 students in Liberia in year one of the pilot. Part of the reason this scale is so exciting to me is that it took Democracy Prep, my charter school network in the US, about 13 years to get to that number of students. And Bridge and Minister Werner have gotten to serve nearly 40,000 students in just year one. So the scale is still big, but it needs to be bigger to get those cost functions down. So for Bridge, one of those cost functions is designing the curriculum and the technology and the hardware and the software that's used in classrooms. And once that's built, the marginal cost for adding each individual student is almost zero. So there is a model here to get to break even in a place like in Liberia, but that's going to require hundreds of thousands of students educated in this method. And so you really have to get to a big scale for the cost to get down to that number that's closer to $40 or $50 per student. I think it is possible, but it's still a long way off. And so right now, Bridge and PSL overall are relying on philanthropy and incredibly generous and thoughtful donors who are recognizing that for an investment of close to $50 a student, you can educate an entire student for a year to get a much better education than they were getting before. Just for a Western audience, one other sort of contextual thing that's helpful is that for Bridge and all the operators, they're using government teachers. So these are the same teachers that were there last year for the most part. They've been retrained, they've been evaluated differently, they've been given different curriculum, but the payroll cost has stayed about the same. So the additional costs are things like curricular materials, additional training, and added context. And so if you think about $50 a student a year, that's about $2,000 for a classroom of 40 kids per classroom per year. The wage bill of that is covering about $150 a month, so let's call that $1,500 a year, leaving only $500 total per classroom for materials, textbooks, technology, and anything else. Now, that sounds like a very small number in a Western context, but as I told you, like the tablet that the teacher gets is $50. So this is doable. I want people to walk away understanding that this is absolutely possible. We've shown it at scale in Kenya. We're starting to get there in Liberia, but it does require a lot more students to be in systems like this rather than it being an incredibly intensive commitment of resources up front before you get to the scale point where it is actually sustainable.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting feature of the Bridge model. No, it was designed from inception to really operate at a scale, no, and I think obviously that scale is required for the model to work, but definitely every single element of that, from the tablet to the way you know the materials, textbooks, etc. are designed. I mean, it's thought of, you know, with the view of bringing costs down to a really minimum, and I think that's what made the model quite attractive to us when we looked into it.
So let me give you one more example on that, because I think it's helpful. In the US context, we think about technology and the way that it's transforming American schools. And so in Liberia, they don't have the resources for the infrastructure, for example, for science labs. The school buildings, as you saw a little bit in the video, are bare bones. Most of them don't have power. You're lucky if you have 2G. But there are tools that we're using in the developed world, like virtual reality, tools that cost like on the order of $50, is a headset that you can now see a virtual reality science lab. And so in the developed world, we can imagine $50 per student to do a science lab in virtual reality. Well, in the developed world, we can't, because that math doesn't add up. But you can get a cardboard version of the same thing for $3. So now if I'm thinking about taking the same thing, I'm bringing the quality down a little bit, but the content that's being delivered to my students in Washington, D.C. is actually going to be the same exact content as can be delivered to kids in Liberia with a $3 piece of cardboard and the phone that the principal is already getting to download those lesson plans. So it's about thinking differently about how we spend money and what we spend money on, and not letting this sort of incredibly impossible challenge, which is saying $50 per student per year, how's that ever possible, stop us from being innovative. And that's where the new thinking that's not just doing it the same way we've done and expecting different results is going to hopefully get us a different set of results.
So I want to ask a question about low-cost private schools here, because we've been talking about PSL schools, which are public schools, they're paid for. But in the developing world, low-cost private schools are a big thing, right? And I think in America we think of public schools as dominating the scene. So first of all, can these sort of partnerships work with low-cost private schools? And can you give me a sense of how big low-cost private schools cover the market in some developing countries?
So by one estimate, in Africa, less than 50% of students are attending government schools already. And where are those students? They're either a good chunk out of school, as we talked about, but they're also in these low-fee, affordable private schools. When we think of private school in the US, in the developed world, it's a very different context. And the idea of spending $7 a month and getting a better education, as is happening in Kenya for 100,000 students across the Bridge Network, that is a very different way to think about what education is. And it is a way that's saying to families who might be living on $2 a day, so this is not, we're not talking about wealthy families here. We're talking about families living on $2 a day per capita and being able to spend what ends up being about 10% of their income on their child's education. That's a choice they're making, and one that is one that we should admire and really talk about as an aspirational opportunity for those families that they haven't had. And they're making rational choices. So one of the things that frustrates me most in this debate is often when critics of affordable private schools or PSL, are basically saying, well, those families don't know what they're doing. And I'm arguing that the families know better than any of us very often in this room, and certainly in Washington, D.C., in Monrovia or in Liberia in Nairobi, what is best for their family. And they're choosing, across Africa, almost 50% of them, to not go to the government-run schools and instead to go to these other schools. And I think we should be more respectful and thoughtful about what that really is saying about the choices that they have as families.
Yeah, I think low-cost private schools are a reality in many developing countries. That's really the case in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other parts of the world as well. In the case of Kenya, and Seth, you might have the latest statistics, but I think I read some time ago that we were talking between 500,000 to 1 million students enrolled in low-cost private schools across the country, and about half of that only in Nairobi. So it's really a big thing, and it's a reality. I mean, why do parents decide to send children to low-cost private schools? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the hidden cost that in some cases we find in public education in some environments. I mean, the maybe proximity issues, ability to vote with their feet at the end of the day in terms of decisions, maybe lack of capacity in some public schools as well. But this is a reality, and it cannot go unnoticed. I think there's a need for governments also to realize that this is a sector that deserves attention, and that ultimately you have to regulate it probably in a different way as how you regulate the traditional mainstream education sector. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for some of these schools just to operate. And again, there's many children that are already enrolled in these schools.
And just to bring more nuance to the context, most of these aren't in chain schools. Most of them aren't run by big operators, but mom and pop schools, which I think there are different policy implications for the thousands and thousands of community schools that are literally run by a single family for any number of reasons, right? And so I think as governments wrestle with the complexity of what they are responsible for stewarding in their national context, a lot of this conversation is about operators, either local or international, that are coming in. But in this case, in real partnership with the government, many governments are facing, as many of us know, thousands of individual operators, and not with a lot of visibility into what's actually happening there, even though they're ultimately responsible for the education of those kids. So I think there are lots of different angles when it is why getting precise about the definition of what kinds of operators you're talking about can have different implications for the policy outcomes that a government might choose.
So, Minister Werner, in a moment I'm going to turn it over to the audience for some questions. But my question is, with the elections coming up, what are your concerns for the sustainability of the program, and what is your hope for the program in 2025?
So let me tell you what we are excited about first. We're excited that President Sirleaf is ending her 2-year term and adhering to constitutional term limits. We're excited that for the first time since 1944, a living president will hand over to another president in Liberia. So these are the things that excite us in Liberia as we begin a political season that ends on the 10th of October when we all go to the polls to choose our next president. But the transition of which you spoke is something that we are looking at carefully as a government for all of these reasons provided. We don't want a reversal on the gains we have made together with the support of the US government and US taxpayer money. So in education, we are very carefully designing a transitional process that will allow the next education secretary or minister in our own case to be able to take the reforms we have put together and carry them forward. So with the support of the Global Partnership for Education, we have developed a comprehensive education sector plan. That's for 5 years in terms of what we want to prioritize to reform. And out of that, we have drawn a 3-year plan, simply saying to ourselves, by 2021, we want to see a trained, qualified, well-paid teacher in every classroom, in every public school. It's a challenge to ourselves. But to do that, we need a team built to make sure that those reforms are implemented now and through the next government. So we put in place what we call an education delivery unit. And it will be a team of experts, civil servants mainly, dedicated to helping the next administration shepherd the reforms forward. And they will be contracted for 2 years. The money we are raising, either through grant or through borrowing, we are planning in terms of results-based achievements. So you get some money up front to work on the priorities listed in the education sector plan. But to access the balance of the money, you must have met some targets. So these are the strategies we are putting in place to make sure that these reforms don't die with the next administration and that they are carried forward. But most importantly, we learned from Ebola that to really deal with a crisis, you need to invest in the communities, right? So these schools, one of the things that we haven't spoken about is that we encourage the operators to go in the communities, engage the communities, have a conversation with the PTAs, the community leadership, and make sure that they are involved in the day-to-day administration of the school. As a result of that, some of the schools are oversubscribed, right? Because the parents see the value. My sense is that if the parents and the communities value these schools, they will live beyond the next administration. And that's what we're working on.
Indeed. Well, we're going to move to some Q&A from the audience. We have a couple of rules for question and answers. First of all, when one of the gentlemen comes around with a microphone, please give your name and your affiliation. And number 2, please ask a question. If you go through with a statement, we will move on to someone else who does have a question.
Thank you, Minister Werner, and to the rest of the panel. My question is...
Your name?
George Werner, with Atlas Mercantile. My question is, we've seen governments in countries in sub-Saharan Africa implement universal primary as well as secondary education, which is supposed to be free. And that has also actually increased student enrollment maybe 3 or 4, fivefold. But however, the PPP in education is being resisted by certain countries. Is there a particular reason why they're not welcoming, say, for instance, the low-cost private schools? And how has Liberia, for instance, circumvented that? And as a government, initiated this process? Thank you.
So, look, good question. The first part, as best as I understand it, you know this very well. I gave you statistics on the population growth in Africa. Fertility rates are very high. And so there's growing demand on health and education. And there are constraints in terms of the fiscal space for government to meet this demand. So we have to think outside of the box to leverage other sources of funding to be able to meet that increase in demand. But more to your point, in terms of why the resistance, I look back in terms of lessons I have learned and things I would do differently from initiating this. I would strengthen communications. You can't take it for granted that the field for education sector reforms is still very conservative in the sense that it's stubborn to change. Even though people want to see change, we disagree on what type of change is needed. So our language for change is more progressive than the actual change itself. So people need to know. And in the beginning, we didn't prioritize communications as we should have. So the program got mischaracterized as a privatization of public schools, and the partnership model was not pushed. So there's communication. As to how we circumvented the pushback, I think we had stakeholder negotiations. We try very hard to convince the beneficiaries. And that was one. The second thing was, I told you earlier that we went around the country. I toured all 15 counties 4 times, and I saw the reality. That was my passion, that was my motivation, and nothing was going to stop me. That's how I circumvented it.
Thank you. My name is Simon Ateba of simonateba.com. Minister, I want to know if your partnership also include feeding, because as they've realized in Nigeria, you can ask the best painter to paint your school or to build it. If children are hungry, they will leave school, and they're trying to do it in Nigeria by providing a meal a day for every student. Secondly, you talked about your budget last year, $41 million. How much is that? How much was that in terms of percentage of the Liberian government? Thank you.
So the Liberian government's budget in aiding giving in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years has pretty much been around 500 million. The national budget, 500 million. So of that, 12% is given to consistently to the education sector, and that includes not just secondary schools, but the public tertiary institutions. Of the 12%, 6% is dedicated to early childhood, primary, and secondary education. So 6% of the budget goes to the international benchmark is 20-25%. At the time our economy was growing at around 7% annually, we thought we could reach that. Then came the commodity crash on the international market. Liberia's main exports are iron ore and rubber, and the prices dropped. And then after that came Ebola, and we lost our investors. There was a time the IMF was predicting that Liberia's growth would be at 0%. We are on our way back now, so that explains the percentage for that. On feeding, you touched upon an issue that concerns all of us, including the funders of the PSL program. Before the program was initiated, we had around 3 hours. Because of the surge in enrollment after Ebola, many of the public schools became overwhelmed and instituted 2-3 shift schools, right, to accommodate the increase in enrollment. So a school session will last for around 3 hours a day, and then another session will come in. To counteract that, in year one, we asked the providers to have an extended instructional time, as supported by research, 6 to 7 hours per day. What we then factored in was school feeding. The World Food Program, Mary's Meals, have been very supportive of government's effort for homegrown school feeding, which is what we do want, to support our farmers to grow more so that we can feed our own people. What we're finding from year one is, as a result of the extended instructional time, we're finding that some children are hungry. And so in year two, we're building into the program an amount, I think it's around 1-point-something million, for school feeding to be able to cover for this. I've had the opportunity to talk to some of my counterparts across the region, from Rwanda and elsewhere, to ask how they deal with the problem of school feeding. And essentially, is by going to parents and saying, look, if your child was at home, what will he or she be eating? If you have that, bring it to school, and the government can add to it to make sure that the child has food for the extended instructional time. So that's a drawback that we're hoping to fix in year two.
Question right here, front row.
Thank you. My name is Annette McGee Johnson, and I have to give some background because I'm here in my own capacity, but I was born in Liberia, and I lived and worked there from 2010 to 2013 at the Ministry of Justice, setting up the First Child Justice program. And so I come with that context in mind and a couple of questions / concerns. Given
We'll
the
have to
issue
make it
of
one question because we're running out of time.
Given
so.
the issue of accessibility in Liberia, I heard mention of the fact that for such a program to work, there is a need for government involvement, but most of the government programs are funded by outside sources. The government has not shown a commitment to children in its budget, based on what we've heard here today. So I'm wondering, how do you all envision such a program being scaled in Liberia to where all children do have access, even leaving aside that there's a lot of controversy in Liberia if this should be the way to go? How do you give access to all children? You're only reaching 7% now. How are you going to get to 100%? Because now we're leaving one problem and we're creating inequalities because we're not accessing everyone. Like you said, the roads, you can't get to most of the country. So I'm really interested in how we're going to create a balanced system that reaches all children.
So the problem of scale?
So, Annette, thank you, and good to see you again. The government has a commitment to children. It is not what it should be, but the government is investing in the children of Liberia, as you well know. The question you've asked about scale is something that really I think about every night. If you wanted the radical George Werner, I dream of a future, say in 5 to 10 years, when kids leaving elementary school can read and write critically well alongside their international partners. To do that, I believe that the best way to go is to leverage the best of private providers. to help the government achieve this. Left to itself, the government doesn't have the capacity, like other governments, to achieve that. At the same time, you need to consider, which is what has happened to me, all the feedback from the international community, from the domestic audience, in terms of this idea is new. You want to be cautious in terms of how you approach skill. So that's where we are, cautiously approaching skill, which is what Seth said earlier. We are waiting the evidence to inform decision making. But we realize that, as a friend once said, children in Liberia don't have the luxury of time to wait. The urgency is now. If we do not do anything radical to change the status quo, we will, in the American way of putting it, leave too many children behind. So you make a valid point about skill. It's something we're considering.
I'd like to thank Minister Werner. I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd thank also the panelists, and please feel free to have the discussion go on online for those of you watching at home. For those of you who are here, we have a reception following immediately in the hall. Join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.